In the late 10th century, something new appeared across the Danish landscape. Great circular strongholds, laid out with unsettling precision. Each fortress formed a perfect ring of rampart and ditch, with 4 monumental gates aligned to the cardinal points and timber-paved streets, crossing at the exact center to divide the interior into 4 quarters of tightly planned longhouses. This was not decoration. It was statecraft rendered in earth and oak. Instead of a single castle on a hill, Denmark gained a network. And that network, raised within a few seasons, changed how power could be projected in the Viking world. To see why, start with the crisis facing Harald Gormson, Harald Bluetooth. Denmark in the 960s and 970s was a patchwork of rival elites, while to the south, the Ottonian emperors pressed hard. In 974, German forces struck north and briefly seized the Dendrochronology and Hythabu. The old Viking way of mustering seasonal warbands and dashing to hotspots could not stabilize a kingdom or secure long frontiers. Bluetooth's answer, beginning in the early mid-980s, was a centrally coordinated building campaign. At least 5 near-identical ring fortresses: Trelleborg near Slagelse, Fyrkat in Himmerland, Aggersborg by the Limfjord, Nonnebakken at Odense, and Borgring near Køge. Excavation and dendrochronology pinned their construction to a tight window around the late 970s, 980s. Timbers at Trelleborg, for example, were felled between late 980 and spring 981. Archaeologists can track that pace because the forts were laid out and built with a repeatable sequence that leaves measurable fingerprints. Geophysical survey, especially magnetometry, plots the ring ditch as a single, well-surveyed curve and picks up the parallel rows of longhouse posts inside. Targeted excavation then confirms the post holes, door thresholds, and timber slots that show standardized spans repeated from quadrant to quadrant. Dendrochronology on gate beams and rampart frameworks, pins felling to the same short window at multiple sites, while construction trenches and rampart cross-sections reveal a consistent recipe: an oak-laced earthen bank, clay and turf revetments, timber-paved streets, then house blocks dropped into pre-planned plots. Even the causeways across ditches follow the plan rather than the terrain. When teams refit broken timbers in the gate structures, they find the same tooling marks and assembly logic reappearing site after site. All of this implies surveyors with measuring ropes, foremen who knew the template, and supply lines capable of feeding and coordinating hundreds of laborers at once. Evidence for centralized command expressed as geometry. The repeating blueprint is unmistakable: precisely circular ramparts engineered from earth and turf, but stiffened with heavy oak frameworks, deep V-section ditches, axial roadways, rectangular blocks for barracks longhouses, and outer works or causeways where terrain required it. Aggersborg, the largest at roughly 240 meters across, held 48 longhouses set 4 by 4 in each quadrant, a layout that could quarter a substantial garrison and their supplies. Uniform geometry was more than style. Placed on sea straits and overland corridors, the Great Belt, the Limfjord, routes toward the Kattegat, the forts sit like clamps on Denmark's arteries. From them, royal officers could provision troops, watch traffic, collect dues, and strike quickly along road and water to stamp out local revolts. The ring form itself had tactical logic: a continuous field of fire with no dead corners, 4 broad gates for sallying or receiving reinforcements, and an interior grid that let a disciplined force redeploy at speed. Archaeology shows these were not inert showpieces. At Trelleborg, arrowheads driven into the rampart and gate structures, burned timbers, and mass graves of young men record real fighting. Strontium isotope analyses on teeth from the associated cemetery indicate that many of the dead were non-locals, pointing to a composite garrison recruited across the wider North Sea Baltic world. Professional troops tied to the royal center rather than to local chiefs. Inside the walls, the archaeology reads like a manual for garrison life. Flooring planks and packed gravel street beds speak to movement at scale. Clusters of storage pits and granaries point to pre-positioned rations. Smithing hearths, slag, and rivets show on-site repair of weapons and fittings, and mixed faunal remains, cattle, sheep, pig, fit a provisioning system rather than ad hoc foraging. Arrowheads recovered from ramparts include both broadheads and bodkins, hinting at mixed roles for defense and counterattack. The orthogonal street grid made drill and musters practical. Troops could form by house block, move along straight lines to the gates, and wheel out onto causeways without crossing each other's paths. In logistical terms, the ring forts functioned as depots and staging grounds as much as fortifications, with stores and skilled craftsmen embedded alongside barracks. That integration, food, kit, repair, and trained bodies within one standardized envelope, is what turns the forts from big earthworks into a repeatable military system. Borgring, discovered by aerial and geophysical survey and investigated over the last decade, preserves the same geometry. Charred gateposts, their hint at violent episodes late in the site's short life. Not every detail is settled. Some forts show limited refurbishment and relatively brief occupation, perhaps only a few decades, which fits a reading of the system as crisis infrastructure, built fast to answer specific threats, then allowed to lapse as politics shifted. Debates also persist over exact authorship and use. Harold's name dominates the chronology and the stylistic unity, but later rulers such as Sweyn Forkbeard likely exploited the sites where it suited their campaigns. What the data do fix is the administrative capacity behind them. Standardized diameters, roughly 120-240 meters, timber cut and assembled to a common plan, and the replication of internal house blocks across the country all imply measurement systems, skilled surveyors, coordinated labor, and reliable supply, hallmarks of a centralized regime. In other words, the ring fortresses were a military technology and a political one. Garrisons, depots, courts, and symbols of a kingship that could organize Denmark at scale. Their decline was as swift as their rise. By the early 11th century, most were abandoned or repurposed. Some, like Aggersborg, probably lingered longer as mustering nodes at the Limfjord choke point. Others never saw full interior build-out. The reasons are practical rather than mysterious. Once the southern frontier stabilized and royal power consolidated, their maintenance costs outweighed their benefits, and strategy pivoted toward overseas ventures in England. Yet their afterlife is substantial. Rediscoveries and excavations in the 20th century, followed by aerial LiDAR mapping and open-area digs in the 21st, have rebuilt their plans in detail. In 2023, the 5 Danish sites were inscribed together on the UNESCO World Heritage List as Viking Age ring fortresses, formal recognition that these are not isolated oddities, but a coherent system. And that is the real lesson. The forts mark a transition from charismatic warband politics to institutional power. They turn Denmark's geography, straits, sounds, land bridges, into a controllable machine, allow rapid royal response without a king personally riding to every crisis, and anchor a monetized, administered realm with coinage, churches, and law. The Viking Age was not only about ships and raids, it was also about surveyors, carpenters, and quartermasters, and about a ruler who bent geometry to governance. If you want more deep dives that follow the archaeology, Dendro dates site plans and battlefield traces to show how design reshaped strategy in the early medieval North. Stay with us and tell us which fortress or frontier you want mapped next.